Another couple of Honolulu pickleball paddles just came in, and now there really is something for everyone. Today we're going to talk about the J3Ks, the J7Ks, and also talk a little bit about how they compare to the J2Ks. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. About a month ago, we reviewed the now insanely popular J2K, which quickly became one of my favorite paddles. In that review, I talked about how good the hybrid shape is because it can work for so many different types of players, but if it still isn't for you, then don't worry because now there's a longer one and a shorter one. I was so excited to get these paddles in for a couple of reasons. One, the J2K was so good that I couldn't wait to try a longer version, which I tend to prefer, and two, I really wanted to see how a Kevlar face would do on a shorter paddle. One of the things that makes Kevlar paddles so good is that adaptivity I've been talking about a lot recently. They are soft when you're hitting the ball lightly and then firm up the harder you swing. Obviously, that's a great thing full stop, but it sounds particularly appealing on a shorter paddle because they are primarily control oriented, so making them a little bit softer is just going to help them in the soft game. So this paddle was always going to be super interesting to test, but of course, before we get into any of that, let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. Now first, let's talk about some specs, starting with the J3K. This paddle weighs between 8.1 and 8.4 ounces. It's 16 inches long with a 16mm core and has a swing weight between 113 and 117. Now Honolulu Pickleball is claiming that this is a 6-inch handle, but apparently they're measuring it a little bit differently because this does not look or feel half an inch longer than most paddles I'm testing these days. I tested it up against a bunch of different paddles, so I'm not really sure why they feel the need to be different here, so I'm just going to call it 5.5 inches. But yeah, it's another one of these 16-inch paddles with long handles, which is a shape that's increased a lot in popularity recently, and with good reason. We'll talk about why a little bit later. The J7K is much longer. It's actually 16.6 inches long, which is longer than a traditional elongated paddle, and you can definitely tell just by holding them up together like this, and you can tell on court as well. It weighs between 8 and 8.4 ounces. It has a swing weight between 118 and 123, and then the same 16mm core. Now with all of Honolulu Pickleball's Kevlar paddles, you can choose from either a standard blue or red Kevlar face, or their black Pro weave. There is a pretty significant difference in terms of feel and performance between the standards and the pros, which we'll cover in the next section. I'm also going to refer a lot to the J2K throughout this review, so I'm quickly going to read off its specs. It weighs between 8 and 8.4 ounces, it has a swing weight between 113 and 115, the same 16mm core, and it is 16.2 inches long. Of course, I will talk about its playability in reference to these two new paddles, but if you do want to watch me go into much more detail about the J2K, go watch our review from a few weeks back. But anyways, let's get into it. First, I want to talk about the difference in playability between the Pro and standard weaves, and yes, there actually is a pretty big one. The main difference between the two is in power. The Pro paddles have a denser weave of Kevlar, which makes them firmer to begin with, but it also feels like that higher density amplifies the effect of Kevlar. Kevlar firms up as you hit harder. The variance in playability on soft shots versus hard shots is what separates it from carbon, and it does feel like this Pro weave pops the ball off with a bit more zing than on the standard one. Of course, what you gain in power, you lose in control, but I wouldn't say the Pros are bad for control. They're just not as good as the standard ones. Honestly, I would say the standard weave paddles are some of the best control paddles on the market right now. That's really it between the Pro and the standard, so go for the Pro if you want a bit more power, and go for the standard if you want a more well-rounded paddle because it's noticeably more controlled, but still has really good power. Obviously, the main difference between the J2, 3, and 7K is paddle shape and how that affects maneuverability and also swing pattern for playability. It's probably not all that surprising that the J3K is by far the most maneuverable of the three. It's shorter and has a really small paddle face, so it's rapid to react without the net and around the baseline. It's not just that it's more maneuverable though, it's also a very whippy paddle because of its high pivot point, which is common on paddles that have a really long handle relative to the length of the paddle face. Because the handle is longer, there's less paddle face to catch the air, which makes them feel significantly faster as you bring them through contact. That's what makes a paddle feel whippy. It's different to just straight up maneuverability, and whippiness helps amplify the effect of wrist lag, which is when you bend your wrist to then snap it through contact for topspin. Just for reference, something like the Selkirk Epic doesn't have that same whippy feel despite being almost as maneuverable. The handle on that paddle is shorter, which makes the paddle face longer and the whole paddle less aerodynamic, so paddles like the J3K are relatively more spin friendly than more standard 16-inch paddles. In terms of playability, that whippiness allows players to more or easily create offensive shots out of nothing with small tweaks of the wrist. This is a very addictive paddle on flicky roll volleys and for dinks where you feign one way and then switch it up at the last second. Even compared to the J2K, this paddle is noticeably better in terms of maneuverability and whippiness. Not only is the J2K longer, but it also has a shorter handle, so it's not nearly as aerodynamic. Now the J7K, as you would expect from something that's even longer than a classic elongated paddle, is definitely not what I would call fast, but it's also not as slow as you might think. I compared it to both a standard elongated paddle in the Perseus and also the Proline Energy, which is 16.7 inches long, and it actually felt closer to the Perseus. I was pleasantly surprised because I do think the Proline Energy is too clunky for the average player, and I was worried that this would feel similar, but I wouldn't use the word clunky to describe this paddle. You will notice that length at the net when you're trying to react super quickly, and it is a little tougher to flick at the ball in general, but you still can. You just have to be a little bit more proactive than you do on the J2 or J3K. I'm going to give each of these paddles a rating out of 100 so you can better understand where I think they lie in terms of speed. The J7K I'm going to give an 80, the J2K I'll give a 90, and the J3K I'm going to give an easy 95. There is a clear difference in paddle speed, and that was always going to be a point of emphasis with these different lengths, but what you lose in quickness, you definitely gain in other areas. First, I want to make it clear that stability and sweet spot size are not the same thing. Stability is a sensation of the paddle staying solid on contact, and it's directly correlated to paddle length and paddle weight. There's a major difference in stability with all these paddles, with the J7K by far the most stable, then the J2K, and the J3K pretty far behind. The J7K is one of the most stable paddles I've ever tested, which makes sense considering it's longer than 16.5 inches, and this stability is most appreciated when trying to counter your opponent's pace. Returning big serves and volleying back against heavy power is awesome here. Just stick it out, it blocks the ball back, and because it's so stable, you also feel very confident when you're swinging out. I can't really say the same about the J3K. This paddle isn't all that stable. It's short and it has a low swing weight, so it did flutter a little bit, and I never felt totally confident with how the ball was coming off the paddle face. The J2K's stability lies somewhere in between the other two, but I will say this paddle feels closer in terms of consistency and predictability to the J7K, and that's because of sweet spot size. We often talk about 16-inch paddles having bigger sweet spots than elongated ones, but that's only partially true. Their paddle faces are wider, so they have wider sweet spots, but they're also shorter, so their sweet spots aren't as long. Now that's especially true of these 16-inch paddles with really long handles. Unfortunately, having this small of a paddle face makes their sweet spots also quite small from north to south. Combining a small sweet spot with less stability makes for a less consistent response off the paddle face, which is why I want to make it clear to everybody that this is not something like a Selkirk Epic. With any version of that paddle, you can just turn off your brain and dink forever. The inconsistency issues here make this paddle a little bit random, and I would suggest adding a little bit of lead to the bottom portion of the paddle face to help with that. Weight is mass, so you will effectively expand the sweet spot towards that weight. Of course, you will lose a little bit of maneuverability, but I do think it is worth the increase in consistency. Still, it'll never be a turn your brain off type of paddle. This is more of a precision instrument, which I know is a little bit tough to understand because we tend to think 16-inch paddles are more user-friendly. I'm going to give the scores for stability and sweet spot size together because that's what leads to user-friendliness and consistency. A 94 for the J7K, a 92 for the J2K, and an 81 for the J3K. I'm not going to harp on about power, spin, and control for too long because they're all objectively excellent on all these paddles, and you can watch me go into more detail about them on the J2K review. In my opinion, spin is their most outstanding feature. For one, top-end spin potential on drives is up there in the 99th percentile, but it's actually spin variety that sets them apart from so many other paddles. The flexibility of this Kevlar sheet allows the paddle to pocket the ball for a split second longer than stiffer paddles, which means you have more purchase over the ball to spin it during dwell time. The J2K had already shocked me for how good it was in the soft spin game, and the same was true for the J7K. I felt in complete control over how much spin I could put on any type of shot. Of course, because it's longer and less whippy, you do have to work a little harder to brush up on the ball, which you notice more at slower swing speeds because you're not crushing the ball with as much force. It performs relatively better on fast spin shots compared to the other two, but once I was used to it being a little slower, I was totally dialed into the soft spin game. The J3K is a crazy paddle in the soft spin game. This amount of maneuverability and whippiness complements the slow-paced spin shot perfectly. Honestly, this is the type of paddle that was made for that shot. That's why earlier I said that this is a precision instrument and that it's quite different to the likes of the Selkirk Epic. This is definitely more geared towards advanced players who can take advantage of its performance in the touch spin game, which is quite difficult. One thing I will say is that this smaller paddle face does make the sweet spot feel a bit firmer than it is on the other two. There is a more thuddy pop off the paddle face here and a more plush response on the J2K and J7K, but not enough for me to say that hurts it in the soft spin game whatsoever. Also, it may not have the same leverage as elongated paddles, but the high pivot point makes it swing similar to longer paddles, so top end spin potential is excellent, albeit a slight notch under the other two. So for spin, I'm going to give the J2K and J7K the same 93 rating. It just depends on whether you prioritize spin on drives or spin in the soft game, and I'm going to give the J3K an easy 95. Honestly, that's one of the best spin paddles right now. Again, these are some of the best Kevlar paddles right now, which means they are great in both power and control, but the J3K and J7K are quite different in how they achieve that. Because it's so much longer, you don't have to work as hard for power on the J7K, but on the flip side, because this is such a fast paddle, it's easy to generate the paddle head speed you need for power on the J3K. It really just depends on what you prefer from your paddle here. The J7K is inherently powerful, and the J3K ends up being plenty powerful as long as you're using it properly, basically once you get your wrist involved. It's kind of the same story with control. The J7K is more consistent, which translates to better control, but then the J3K becomes an absolute weapon in the control game if you tap into that maneuverability. This is one of the best paddles for shots that involve deception because of how quickly you can change directions, but that also makes it a slightly riskier paddle. One tiny wrong move and the ball is shooting in the wrong direction. Basically, the J3K has a playfulness that requires constant action and attention from the user, whereas the J3K is much more methodical, solid, and consistent. You can lock your wrist here and let the paddle do the work, but it also doesn't have the same upside that playfulness will give you. The J2K slots in really nicely between the two of them. It has a bit of that playfulness, but also doesn't require it, which is again why I'm saying this is such an incredibly well-rounded paddle. So I'm going to give it a 94 for both power and control. For control, I'm going to give the J7K a 90 and a 93 for power. Both are good, but I think this shape lends itself a little bit better for a power-oriented game, especially with drives from the baseline. The J3K, I'll give a 90 for control and an 87 for power, but these are both contingent on using its whippiness to get the most out of the paddle. Of course, with the Pro Weave version of these paddles, just up power a little bit and take that away from their control, like I said in the earlier section. So all three of these paddles are fantastic and will work wonders in the right player's hands, but I do first want to explain who the J3K is made for because this is the most unique paddle of the three. To me, this paddle is made for advanced doubles players who want to get creative with their shot selection and want their paddle to complement that creativity as best as possible. The J7K is also pretty unique because it is 16.6 inches long, but honestly, don't be deterred by that length because it really doesn't negatively affect it too much. I think it does help with stability and plow through, but not at the expense of that much maneuverability, which was my main fear going into this review. To me, I still think the J2K is going to stay king for Honolulu Pickleball though. It really is the perfect combination of the other two. It's one of the most well-rounded all-court paddles right now, and there's a reason it keeps selling out almost as soon as we bring them in. It has quickly become the paddle of the people. Advanced players, intermediates, beginners, really anyone can benefit from this. That's how good it is. I'm going to keep using these. I don't think the J3K will ever be for me, but the 7 and the 2 are definitely at the top of my list for potential paddle switches, so we'll see how that goes. I still have to make that paddle journey video one day. Anyways, that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo any of these, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can visit us online at racketsandrunners.ca.